When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate to do something, to say something, to speak up, to speak out, and find a way to get in the way of what I call good trouble, unnecessary trouble.
Could you talk about when you first met him?
I grew up in segregated rural Alabama, and I didn't like the signs that I saw saying white and colored. White men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. The action of Dr. King inspired me to find a way to get in the way. I had been told by my mother, my father, my grandparents, and great-grandparents, when I would ask questions, they would say, don't get in trouble, don't get in the way. But I felt like Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking directly to me, saying, John Robert Lewis, you too can do something. So in 1957, at the age of 17, I wrote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a letter. I didn't tell my mother, my father, any of my sisters or brothers or teachers. I wanted to attend a little college 10 miles from my home called Troy State College. I applied to go there, submitted my application, my high school transcript. So I wrote this letter. Dr. King wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. So in September 1957, I boarded a bus. I traveled from Troy, Alabama, rural Alabama, past Montgomery to Nashville to go to school. An uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill, more money than I ever had, gave me a Foot Locker, put everything that I own, my few books, my few clothing in that Foot Locker, and took a Greyhound bus to Nashville. And Dr. King later heard through one of my teachers that I was in Nashville studying. So Martin Luther King Jr. got back in touch with me and told me when I was home for spring break to come and see him. So in March of 1958, by this time I'm 18 years old, I boarded a bus. I traveled from Troy to Montgomery. And a young lawyer by the name of Fred Gray, who was a lawyer for Rosa Parks, for Dr. King, and the people involved in the Montgomery bus boycott, met me at the Greyhound bus station and drove me to the First Baptist Church in downtown Montgomery, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and ushered me into the pastor's study. I saw Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy standing behind a desk. I was so scared, I didn't know what to say or what to do. And Dr. King said, are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis? And I said, Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis, but he still called me the boy from Troy. And he said, you know, if you want to go to Troy State College, we will support you. We may have to sue the state of Alabama. We may have to sue Troy State, but we're prepared to help you. Go back home and have a discussion with your mother, your father. You know, your home could be bombed. That's what he said. Your home could be burned. Your family could lose their land. You could be beaten. You could be harmed. And I went back, had a discussion with my mother and my father. They were so afraid that something could happen to me, it could happen to them, or we could lose the land, lose the farm. So they didn't want to have anything to do with my attempting to enroll at the school. And I continued to study in Nashville. And from time to time, Martin Luther King Jr. would come to Nashville to speak at Fisk University, at the city auditorium, tell the story of the movement. Rosa Parks would come there. And I stayed in touch with Dr. King. And he became in a sense, my hero. In a sense, he became my big brother. And he would say over and over, stay in school, get an education, and when you finish school, maybe you can come and work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, his organization. So I got involved in the sit-ins, went on the freedom rides. And the first time I got arrested, I felt free. I felt liberated. I felt like I crossed over. And then a group of us left Washington, D.C. to go on the freedom rides. 13 of us. We were beaten. We were left bloody at the Greyhound bus station in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and later at the Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, Alabama. During the height of the movement, it was not just a black movement. There were hundreds and thousands of white American, many Asian American, Native American, and Latinos participated. There were white people beaten and left bloody during the freedom rides in 1961. There were white people and others beaten in Selma and murdered. When we were jailed in Mississippi during the freedom ride, more than 400 of us, the majority were white men and women from all across America. And when we had the Mississippi Freedom Summer, the majority of the volunteers. And I will never, ever forget, during the summer of 1964, Freedom Summer, 3 young men, Andy Goodman, Mickey Scherner, from New York City, white, and James Chaney from Mississippi, went out to investigate the burning of an African-American church to be used for voter registration workshop. They were stopped by the sheriff, arrested, detained, turned over to members of the Klan, where they were beaten and later shot, murdered. These 3 young men died together. But none of us lived in fear. You couldn't become immobilized by what others were doing or saying. We felt we had a job to do. We were part of a movement. And we would not let any person or any group stop us.
As Black Power rose, Martin Luther King understood that it was either as a term or as a method. And he also talked of himself as not just a black leader, but sort of expanding the movement. As the movement started to change, what were those kind of discussions like with you and him, and how did you struggle?
Well, I never really had a long-term discussion with Dr. King about the concept or the idea or the philosophy of Black Power. I remember how the term emerged. I was here in Washington, D.C. It was during the Harvard University graduation. And I believe Adam Clayton Powell had spoken, and he used the phrase audacious Black Power, and he used Black Power or blackness 2 or 3 times in this speech. And Stokely Carmichael shared it with me. And I think that rang a bell for him. And then he started using the phrase. But in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we seldom ever used slogan or rhetoric. We believed in programs, the 1, 2, 3s, the ABCs of doing this or doing that. So I never really used it.
Afterwards, with the idea of the Poor People's March, were you part of any of those discussions?
I remember very well being at one of the meetings, discussing the Poor People's Campaign. At this time, I was serving on the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We met at Pasco's in Atlanta, where Dr. King brought a group representing those that have been left out and left behind. There were low-income whites, low-income African American, Latinos, and Asian American, and Native American, all meeting together, preparing to take their issues, the concerns, and the needs of poor people to Washington to camp out. People were ready. People were prepared to go and stay a while. And at the same time, there was a struggle going on in Memphis. Dr. King hadn't planned to go to Memphis. But a young man by the name of Jim Lawson, who became our teacher during the preparation for the sit-ins and the Freedom Rides. Jim Lawson was one of these brilliant young Methodist ministers who had studied the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. Dr. King used to come to Nashville and speak. He had so much love and admiration for Jim Lawson. This young guy was just smart. He had studied Gandhi. He had studied Thoreau and civil disobedience. He prepared us. So when Dr. King would come in and salute the Nashville movement, he would say, Jim Lawson, he had a greater understanding of the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence than anyone he knew.
Well, I was going to jump to the assassination. Were you with Bobby Kennedy then?
In 1968, I was in Indianapolis, Indiana, organizing for Bobby Kennedy. And a group of us were planning a rally in a transition neighborhood. It was an outdoor rally. And there was some debate about whether Bobby Kennedy should come and speak. Some of us had heard that Dr. King had been shot, but we didn't know his condition. And I, for one, kept insisting that Bobby Kennedy had to come and speak to the crowd that were waiting. And he did come and speak. And it was Robert Kennedy who announced that evening, April 4th, 1968, that he had some bad news. He said, in effect, that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And a hush came over the crowd. Some people cried. And then I said to myself, well, we still have Bobby. And I started crying a little more. Because if it hadn't been for Martin Luther King Jr., I don't know what would have happened to me. Growing up very, very poor in rural Alabama. Dr. King had provided a light for some of us, provided hope for some of us. He was the embodiment of our future. When Bobby Kennedy heard that Dr. King had been assassinated, he was shaken. He invited us that evening to come to his room at a hotel in Indianapolis. Some of us sat on the floor, others on his bed, and we all mourned and cried together. Even he was shaken, visibly shaken by it all. I think he admired Dr. King. I knew that his brother, President Kennedy, admired Dr. King. They probably had some differences, but I remember the day of the march, when President Kennedy invited all of us, all of the speakers, down to the White House, and he stood in the door of the Oval Office, greeting each one of us, saying, you did a good job. He was beaming like a proud father. He got to Dr. King, he said, you did a good job, and you had a dream. That was my last time seeing President Kennedy. So I felt that when President Kennedy was assassinated, and later Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy, 2 months after Dr. King, that something died in all of us. Something died in America. Some of that sense of hope and faith died.
After the assassination and the sort of the violence that broke out across the country, how did you feel about that as a practitioner of nonviolence?
But Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would say that the riot became the language of the unheard. And somehow, he would say, we have to give people some victory. We have to give people a sense of hope. I never liked violence. Dr. King didn't like violence. I think we grew to accept the way of peace, accept the philosophy of nonviolence as a way of living, as a way of life. Instead, in effect, you may beat me, you may throw me in jail, you may even kill me, but I'm going to adhere to the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. And many of the young people, many of the students that came out of the movement, young people, lived that way. They were willing to put their bodies on the line. During that period, in the early 60s, mid-60s, I was arrested, jailed, beaten, left bloody, unconscious. Almost died on that bridge. Had a concussion. Arrested 40 times during the 60s. And since I've been in Congress, another 5 times. And I'm probably going to get arrested again for something. My philosophy, a philosophy that Dr. King shared, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate to do something, to say something, to speak up, to speak out, and find a way to get in the way of what I call good trouble, unnecessary trouble.
Do you feel that we're in a period of white backlash now? Is it cyclical?
There's something happening in America today, but I wouldn't necessarily call it white backlash. I think there's a philosophy, an ideology that is moving around. There are forces in America today want to build walls. But there are other forces that want to build bridges. We're brothers and sisters. We all have to learn to live together on this little piece of real estate we call America, or on this planet. And that must be the lesson, not just for us, the adults, but for our children and unborn generation. If we can get it right here in America, just maybe we can serve as a model for the rest of the world.
You've had this commitment to nonviolence to this day. Is nonviolence still a tactic you personally, if you talk about how you've used it recently?
Well, nonviolence, the philosophy is more than a tactic for me. It is one of those immutable principles that you cannot deviate from. It got to be part of your whole being. You come to that point where you respect the dignity and the worth of every human being. And you cannot give up on it if you're going to create what Dr. King called the beloved community. If you're going to be able to redeem the soul of America, you cannot and must not give up on this concept, this belief, this way of life. Because as A. Philip Randolph indicated to many of us, this unbelievable man who was the dean of black leadership, during the 60s, who had this whole idea of a march on Washington during the days of Roosevelt, the days of Truman, and it all came together during the days of Kennedy. In some of these meetings, Mr. Randolph would say over and over again, maybe our foremothers and our forefathers all came to this great land in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. Dr. King put it another way. We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters. If not, we'll perish as fools. And Dr. King probably says something like this today. It doesn't matter whether we're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. We're one people, we're one family. We all live in the same house. Not just the American house, but the world house.